What if emotions could be surgically removed, one organ at a time? Imagine, for a moment, the terrifying possibility: a cold, sterile operating room, bright lights casting harsh shadows on the walls, the soft hum of medical instruments in the background. A surgeon stands at the ready, scalpel in hand, poised to cut into the very essence of what makes you human. Not just your body, but your emotions, the things that define your thoughts, your behavior, your deepest desires, are about to be excised. Piece by piece, organ by organ, your ability to feel, to love, to grieve, to rage, is about to be severed from your soul. What remains when the surgeon is done? Are you still you, or is the core of your humanity gone? This wasn't some dystopian fantasy conjured by a mad writer, but a chilling reality that took place in 1881, in Florence, Italy. It was a time when the lines between scientific discovery and dangerous experimentation were often blurred, and the understanding of human emotions was still in its infancy. The world was beginning to grapple with new medical theories, some of them radical, some of them life-saving, but some would prove to be catastrophically misguided. Florence, once known for its Renaissance grandeur, was now at the forefront of a new kind of scientific ambition, one that involved a surgeon who believed that the human soul, its very emotional core, could be physically removed. The organs, in his mind, weren't just biological. Each one played a part in our ability to feel, to experience life. If you could remove the parts that governed emotion, could you create the ultimate human? Could you craft someone free from the burdens of emotional chaos? It all began with the surgeon himself, a man whose intellect was as sharp as his scalpel, but whose understanding of human nature was deeply flawed. He wasn't a character out of a Gothic novel, though it may seem like he should be. He was a trained, reputable surgeon in 19th-century Florence, a man who adhered to the medical principles of the time but sought to push beyond their limits. His name was not widely remembered, for his deeds were not to be celebrated. But for a brief time, his name was synonymous with a horrifying concept: the surgical removal of emotions. In an era where the human mind was still largely a mystery, he believed that emotions were not abstract feelings, but tangible, anatomical phenomena. Love, rage, grief, they had physical forms, physical places within the body, and if those places could be found, then they could be surgically removed. Imagine the profound implications of such a theory. At the time, the field of psychiatry was still in its infancy, and doctors were struggling to understand how the mind and body were connected. The idea of separating the two was not entirely out of left field. After all, it had been a common belief for centuries that the soul resided somewhere in the body, and that it could be manipulated or healed by physical means. This surgeon, in his quest to master human emotions, was simply taking that belief to an extreme. If emotions had a physical location, perhaps they could be excised like a tumor, leaving a person clean, free from the pain and volatility of their inner world. But what did it mean to be free from emotions? Could a person truly live without love, without grief, without the anger that drives so much of human action? And more importantly, what would it cost to achieve such a state? These were questions the surgeon had not fully answered, nor could he have ever fully understood, because the consequences of his work would prove to be far darker than he ever anticipated. The world at large did not yet grasp the danger of this experiment. Medicine was moving fast, and people were fascinated by the idea of controlling the mind through the body. Surgeons were performing groundbreaking, sometimes brutal, procedures, attempts to cure mental illnesses through physical means, such as lobotomies and early forms of brain surgery. But none of these efforts approached the extremity of what the Florence surgeon had in mind. He believed that emotions themselves were like physical ailments, diseases to be cured by medical intervention. As the surgeon prepared for his first experiments, the sense of dread that would later surround his work was still in its infancy. He was hailed as an innovator by some, a genius pushing the boundaries of medical science. Others, of course, were far more skeptical. Still, the pressure to prove his theories only grew stronger. He wanted to show the world that emotions were not some mysterious, intangible force, but something that could be understood, controlled, and ultimately removed from the human experience. And so, he began his work, cutting into the bodies of willing, or perhaps unwilling, patients in a desperate attempt to make his theory a reality. What followed was something that would forever alter the lives of those who came into contact with the surgeon. His first subject, a man desperate to rid himself of deep, overwhelming sorrow, offered himself as the perfect candidate. The man had lost his family in a tragic accident, and the grief had consumed him entirely. The surgeon's offer was simple. He could rid the man of his sorrow, by removing the organ that housed his sadness. But which organ was that? The surgeon believed it was the heart. After all, the heart was often seen as the seat of emotion, the place where love, joy, and sorrow resided. And so, the surgeon began the procedure, carefully opening the chest, removing what he believed to be the organ responsible for his patient's emotional turmoil. But the aftermath was not what anyone had expected. The man did not walk away from the surgery freed from sorrow. He walked away empty, unable to feel anything at all. The surgeon's theory had not been proven. Instead, he had created something far worse than the grief he had aimed to eradicate. The man was no longer capable of feeling sadness, but he was also incapable of feeling joy, love, or any emotion at all. He was, in a very real sense, hollow. The surgeon was undeterred. He believed this to be a misstep, a flaw in his approach, but not a failure of the concept itself. If one organ could cause so much emotional pain, then surely the solution was to continue removing organs, one at a time, until the human soul was purged of its emotional burdens. And so, the experiments continued. Each new patient, each new incision, seemed to lead to deeper, more unsettling consequences. As the surgeon's work progressed, the patients grew increasingly numb to the world around them. Some could no longer speak, others could not walk, and a few even lost the ability to remember their own names. The surgeon's ambition had reached a fever pitch, but so too had the dangers of his practices. The emotional isolation his subjects endured seemed to warp them, making them less human with each passing day. The public, however, remained unaware of the full extent of the surgeon's actions. Those who underwent the procedures were often too far gone to speak out, and the few who did were dismissed as mad or as failures of the experiment. The surgeon's reputation only grew, as did his desire to continue refining his work. But in the quiet corners of the medical community, whispers began to circulate. Some began to wonder if he had gone too far, if the quest to remove emotion from the body was not just an academic exercise, but a moral monstrosity. Yet, the surgeon pushed forward, undeterred by the growing unease around him. For him, the work was never about the patients. It was about proving that science could control the human soul. In the years that followed, the surgeon's experiments would become infamous, but not in the way he had hoped. His name would be remembered not for the supposed medical breakthrough he had envisioned, but for the horrors he had unleashed in his pursuit of understanding human emotions. His belief in the power of science to shape the soul would eventually be seen not as a triumph of medicine, but as a cautionary tale of how far human ambition could go when it sought to control the uncontrollable. This was a time of great medical ambition, but also a time of great moral blindness. The surgeon, in his desperation to rid the world of emotional suffering, had inflicted far more damage than he could have ever anticipated. His story, now largely forgotten, remains a haunting reminder of how unchecked ambition, coupled with the belief that science can fix everything, can lead to devastating consequences. What if emotions could be surgically removed? It's a question that lingers long after the surgeon's work was laid to rest, a question that speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human. And perhaps, in the end, that's the most disturbing part of all. Florence, Italy, in the late 19th century, was a city of contrast, a place where the shadow of its Renaissance past still loomed large, and yet, the currents of modernity were beginning to swirl, giving rise to a new era of scientific exploration and intellectual ferment. It was a city that had once been the cradle of artistic genius, where the Medici family had funded the work of great minds like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. But now, in the 1880s, Florence was caught in the tension between its illustrious history and the dawning age of industrialization, experimentation, and medical revolution. The intellectual climate of this time was ripe for new ideas to take root, ideas that would challenge established norms, sometimes in shocking ways. The world of medicine, in particular, was undergoing dramatic shifts. The field was evolving rapidly, but it was still young, uncertain, and often dangerously experimental. Surgery had begun to emerge as a more trusted form of treatment, though it was still a treacherous endeavor, fraught with risk. Anesthesia, in its infancy, was a tool that made operations less excruciating, but it was far from perfect. Surgeons, despite their growing technical expertise, often worked without a complete understanding of the human body, especially the complexities of the mind and emotions. There were still many mysteries about how the mind worked and how it related to the body. This gap in knowledge would set the stage for radical and dangerous theories to flourish. During this period, the relationship between the mind and the body was a subject of intense debate. Philosophers and early psychologists were starting to unravel the idea that the brain and emotions were inextricably linked, but the scientific community had not yet grasped the full scope of this connection. Figures like Sigmund Freud, just beginning to gain prominence, were making strides in psychoanalysis, proposing ideas about the unconscious mind, repression, and the internal conflicts that could shape human behavior. However, these theories were still in their infancy, and medicine was a long way from understanding the true complexity of mental health. At the same time, other, more dangerous theories were gaining traction. There were those who believed that the mind and body could be separated entirely, that emotions were not abstract feelings, but physical processes, tangible phenomena that could be located and manipulated within the body. It was against this intellectual backdrop that the surgeon in Florence began his work. His ideas were radical, not only for their time but for any time. He believed that emotions were not just intangible forces or fleeting mental states, but that they were actually embedded in physical organs within the body. To him, love, grief, joy, anger, these emotions had specific locations in the human anatomy. If these organs could be identified, they could be removed, excised from the body like an infected appendage. In his mind, emotions were no different from diseases, illnesses that could be cured by surgical intervention. And if emotions could be eradicated in this way, the human being could be freed from their tyranny, liberated from the emotional burdens that so often led to suffering. But this was not a noble quest for healing. It was an obsession, one that would blur the line between science and madness. Florence, in the late 1800s, had already developed a reputation as a center for medical innovation. The city was home to some of the most well-known hospitals and universities in Italy, where medical professionals were pushing the boundaries of what was known in the field of surgery. It was a place where the human body was dissected and examined with clinical precision, and where new theories about the brain and nervous system were emerging. However, even as surgeons like those in Florence were performing groundbreaking procedures, there were still very few ethical boundaries in place to protect patients from untested or dangerous experiments. At the time, many doctors were still under the sway of ancient medical ideas. The theory of humors, which suggested that bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, were responsible for emotions and physical health, still held some influence. This ancient framework had been gradually replaced by the more modern understanding of anatomy and physiology, but there were still lingering beliefs that emotions and physical health were more tightly connected than we would think today. Some physicians were exploring the possibility that emotions were not only a product of the mind, but that they had tangible, physical manifestations that could be understood and controlled. It was this belief that led to increasingly bizarre treatments, including the surgeon's experiments. In this climate of intellectual and medical ferment, the surgeon in Florence began to explore his radical ideas. His work was initially framed within the context of emotional healing. He believed that mental suffering was not just a matter of the mind but was reflected in the body itself. If someone was depressed, for example, he believed there would be a physical manifestation of that depression, something that could be detected and removed. Emotions like sadness, anger, and fear, in his view, was simply the body's way of reacting to internal stimuli, and if they could be located, they could be excised. What made the surgeon's theory particularly dangerous was the absence of any real scientific evidence to support it. His beliefs were not grounded in a well-developed understanding of human psychology or neurobiology. Instead, they were fueled by the desire to control what he saw as a chaotic and uncontrollable force, the emotional life of human beings. This was an age of great medical ambition, where doctors and surgeons, in their drive to cure and innovate, often ventured into ethically questionable territory. The pursuit of knowledge sometimes came at the expense of the very humanity that knowledge was supposed to serve. In a sense, the surgeon in Florence saw himself as a pioneer, a visionary seeking to push the boundaries of medicine to its farthest reaches. But what he failed to see was that the very thing he was trying to cure, the complexity of human emotion, was not a disease, but an integral part of the human experience. At the time, Florence was also a city of great cultural and political significance, and this, too, played a role in shaping the surgeon's work. The cultural legacy of the Renaissance had created an environment where the ideal of human perfection was a prevailing theme, and it was not uncommon for medical practitioners to believe that human beings could be perfected or improved upon through scientific and technological advancements. In many ways, the surgeon in Florence viewed his work as a natural extension of this legacy, a quest to perfect the human body and mind. But this idealism quickly veered into dangerous territory, as his belief that emotions could be physically removed from the body was a gross oversimplification of the complexity of the human psyche. His ambition was so all-consuming that he failed to consider the consequences of his actions, both for his patients and for the future of medical ethics. As Florence became a hub for new medical experimentation, it also became a place where the darker side of science reared its head. Surgeons and doctors were performing procedures with little regard for the ethical or moral implications, driven by the belief that their innovations would ultimately benefit humanity. It was an era when the lines between scientific progress and human suffering were often difficult to distinguish. And as the surgeon in Florence began his own work, he became part of a larger movement that sought to harness science for purposes that could not always be justified. The environment in Florence during the late 1800s was one where ambition and intellectual curiosity were valued above all else. The city's medical community was filled with brilliant minds, many of whom were attempting to solve the mysteries of the human body and mind. But in the process, they often overlooked the dangers of their own pursuits. The surgeon's experiments, though not widely known at the time, were part of this larger narrative of medical overreach, an attempt to control and manipulate the human body in ways that were, by today's standards, unthinkable. As his theories gained traction, the surgeon found himself at the center of a storm of controversy. He had his supporters, many of whom were eager to see the potential of his work, but he also had critics who saw his ideas as nothing more than a dangerous form of pseudoscience. The debate surrounding his methods was not just one of medical ethics, but of deeper philosophical questions about the nature of humanity itself. Could emotions truly be excised from the body? And if they could, what did that mean for our understanding of human nature? Was the surgeon's vision of a perfect, emotionless human being a noble goal, or a horrifying attempt to erase what made us human in the first place? In the end, the surgeon's work would become a dark chapter in the history of medicine, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of treating human beings as subjects for scientific experimentation without regard for their autonomy or dignity. Florence, once a beacon of enlightenment, had become the backdrop for one of the most disturbing chapters in the annals of medical history. The surgeon's work, in its sheer audacity and disregard for ethical boundaries, would serve as a grim reminder that not all progress is beneficial, and that sometimes, the pursuit of knowledge can lead to devastating consequences. The surgeon at the heart of this chilling tale was not a faceless madman, nor a forgotten figure relegated to the shadows of medical history. He was a man of his time, intelligent, well-educated, and deeply driven by an almost obsessive desire to understand and control the human mind. His intellectual pursuits had led him down paths that were both groundbreaking and dangerous, a dichotomy that would come to define his legacy. He was, at first glance, a man with a clear and noble purpose, to alleviate the suffering of his fellow human beings. Yet, in his pursuit of knowledge, he ventured into realms that blurred the line between science and madness. And the very pursuit that had driven him to greatness would, in the end, become his undoing. Born into a world still wrestling with the burgeoning fields of psychology, psychiatry, and neurology, this surgeon had been shaped by a unique blend of classical education and the emerging scientific revolution. He had studied medicine in some of Europe's finest institutions, where he was exposed to the cutting-edge theories of his time. The ideas that shape his beliefs about the human mind were rooted in the scientific advancements of the late 19th century, but they were also influenced by older philosophical traditions, particularly those of the ancient Greeks, who viewed the human body as a machine, a set of parts that could be studied, repaired, and perfected. But unlike his predecessors, the surgeon saw something far more radical: the possibility of dissecting and removing not just the body's physical components, but its emotional and psychological facets as well. His early medical education had taught him that the human body was a system of organs, each with its own purpose, each dependent on the others to function correctly. The body, in his view, was a machine that could be repaired or adjusted. He had become fascinated by the idea that emotions were not merely abstract concepts, but physical phenomena that could be isolated within the body. The connection between mind and body, which was just beginning to be explored in the world of science, was a concept that the surgeon took to its most extreme interpretation. He was not content with merely understanding the relationship between emotions and the body. He sought to control it. In his mind, if emotions could be isolated and located within specific organs, they could also be removed. The human being could be freed from the weight of emotional suffering, leaving behind only the cold, rational functions of the body. It was a chilling vision, one that would come to define his life's work. What set the surgeon apart from other medical professionals of his time was not just his medical training, but his unwavering belief in the physical nature of emotions. Unlike other doctors who viewed emotions as psychological conditions, the surgeon saw them as biological processes, as tangible as any organ or muscle. He was influenced by the early work of psychiatrists who were just beginning to theorize about the brain's role in emotional regulation, but he took their ideas to an extreme. While others were attempting to understand the connection between the mind and body, he believed that emotions were directly linked to specific physical organs. To him, the heart wasn't just the organ that pumped blood, it was the seat of love, of joy, of sorrow. The brain wasn't merely the control center of the body, it was where the deepest fears and desires resided. The liver, in his view, could hold rage, while the stomach could harbor grief. These beliefs, while considered unorthodox by most in the medical community, were the foundation of his experiments. At first, the surgeon's ideas were met with skepticism. There were whispers of his unconventional theories in the medical community, but most considered them to be the product of an overly ambitious mind, one that had become obsessed with an impossible task. Yet, as his confidence grew, so too did his willingness to experiment. In his view, traditional medical treatments were insufficient to deal with the complexities of emotional pain. Pills, potions, and psychotherapy had failed to provide the relief that many patients sought, so he began to explore more drastic measures. He began performing surgeries that he believed would remove the very source of emotional suffering, excising not just diseased organs but the emotional burdens that these organs supposedly held. His first experiments were crude, but his belief in the efficacy of his methods only grew stronger as he continued. He was not merely a doctor performing routine operations, he was a pioneer, someone who believed that he could unlock the mysteries of the human condition through surgery. To him, each incision, each organ removed, brought him one step closer to understanding the true nature of human emotions. And as he carried out these surgeries, he became increasingly convinced that his work would revolutionize the field of medicine. He viewed himself as a trailblazer, a man on the verge of uncovering the key to human happiness. In his mind, the ability to remove emotions was the ultimate triumph over human suffering. But it wasn't just about alleviating pain, it was about controlling the human experience itself. The surgeon's first experiment was conducted on a man who had been consumed by grief. This patient, devastated by the loss of his family in a tragic accident, had sought medical help in a desperate bid to end his sorrow. The surgeon believed that if he could locate the organ responsible for the man's overwhelming sadness, he could remove it, thus liberating the man from his despair. To the surgeon, this was a simple matter of cutting away the source of the emotional pain, just as one might remove an infected organ. The heart, he believed, was the seat of grief. And so, he cut into the man's chest, performing a procedure that would later be deemed grotesque. But when the man emerged from the surgery, something was terribly wrong. He no longer felt grief, but he also felt nothing at all. The surgeon's first failure was an unsettling one, but it did not deter him. In fact, it reinforced his belief that emotions were tied to specific physical organs, and that he had simply failed to remove the right one. This failure, however, would not be his last. The surgeon's experiments grew more extreme as time went on. He began to broaden his approach, exploring the possibility that multiple organs, not just the heart, played a role in the expression of emotion. Each new surgery was a test of his theories, each patient a subject in an experiment he believed would ultimately lead to the elimination of emotional suffering. He began to perform surgeries on patients who experienced a range of emotional states: fear, anger, anxiety, and depression. Each time, he believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. Yet, time and again, the results were disastrous. The patients would return from their surgeries, not cured, but hollowed out, unable to feel the emotions that had once defined them. The surgeon's obsession with his work deepened. He became less concerned with the well-being of his patients and more consumed by the need to prove his theories. He began to experiment on more vulnerable individuals, those who were desperate for relief from their emotional pain. His patients were often too far gone, too hopeless, to question the legitimacy of his methods. Some came willingly, seeking an escape from their emotional turmoil. Others were coerced, manipulated into believing that the only way to end their suffering was through his radical procedures. The surgeon's increasingly reckless behavior went unchecked, as the ethical standards of the time were non-existent in the face of medical experimentation. Florence, with its long history of artistic and intellectual achievement, had now become a place where human suffering was dissected and manipulated, where the very essence of humanity was being sliced away in the name of science. Despite the growing evidence that his procedures were having disastrous effects, the surgeon's conviction never wavered. He believed that the results he had seen so far were not failures, but necessary steps on the path to his ultimate goal, the creation of a human being free from the tyranny of emotion. In his mind, his work was not about causing harm, it was about making human beings better, more efficient, more rational. But this belief came at the cost of his humanity. The more he cut into his patients, the more he lost sight of the very thing he had set out to protect, their sense of self, their ability to feel, to experience, to live. In his pursuit of this ideal, the surgeon ignored the most fundamental question of all: what does it mean to be human? Was it not our emotions that gave us meaning? Did he not understand that the very thing he sought to remove, emotion, was the very thing that made life worth living? By attempting to cut away the emotional turmoil, he had created something far worse: empty shells of people who could no longer feel the joys and sorrows that define the human experience. And in the end, the surgeon himself became a tragic figure, a man so consumed by his own theories that he lost sight of the humanity he had once vowed to protect. In the years that followed, the surgeon's name would fade from memory, his work buried beneath the weight of medical ethics and moral responsibility. But his experiments remain a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the price that can be paid when science and humanity collide. And though the surgeon's name may be forgotten, his story continues to echo through the annals of medical history, a cautionary tale of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge loses its way. The first surgery was a moment of quiet anticipation. The operating room, a sterile environment where the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the faint, metallic tang of surgical instruments, became the stage for a procedure that would blur the lines between science and horror. The patient was a man whose grief had become all-consuming, a man whose world had been shattered by the death of his family in a tragic accident. His sorrow was so profound, so overwhelming, that it had driven him to the point of desperation. For months, he had sought relief in various forms, therapists, medicines, even spiritual guidance, but nothing could ease the weight of his sadness. When he heard of the surgeon's radical theory, it seemed like a final hope, a chance to rid himself of the deep, insurmountable grief that had stolen his ability to feel joy, to connect with others, to live. The surgeon, in his belief that emotions were not abstract but instead tied to physical organs, had convinced this man that the only way to truly heal was to remove the source of his suffering, his grief. And to the surgeon, grief was no mere psychological affliction. It had a physical location. The heart, he believed, was the organ that housed the emotional pain of loss, and so it was to the heart that he turned first. With a mix of scientific certainty and chilling confidence, the surgeon prepared for the operation that he thought would solve all of his patients' problems, that would end the suffering of both the body and the soul. The procedure itself was crude by today's standards, though not entirely unorthodox for the time. The surgeon made an incision across the patient's chest, cutting through layers of flesh and muscle to reach the heart. There was no anesthesia beyond the barest form of pain relief, no advanced tools to guide his hand. He worked swiftly, methodically, with the precision that he had spent years perfecting in medical school and practice. Every motion was calculated. Every step in the procedure, to him, was another step toward proving his theory. He believed that if he could just remove the right part of the heart, the man's sorrow would be gone, replaced by the peace and emotional clarity that the surgeon promised. The operating room was quiet except for the sound of the surgeon's breath and the rhythmic pulse of the patient's heart, a reminder of the life he was attempting to manipulate, to control. As the surgeon excised the heart, he believed he was severing the man's emotional burden. He imagined that once the organ was removed, the grief would vanish, and the patient would be free to live without the haunting weight of sadness. But when the surgery was complete and the patient was wheeled back into recovery, something strange began to unfold. At first, the absence of grief seemed promising. The patient did not cry, did not seem to lament the loss of his family. But there was something missing in his eyes, something that could not be ignored. The patient seemed distant, detached from the world around him. He did not feel sorrow, but neither did he feel joy. In fact, he did not seem to feel anything at all. The surgeon's heart swelled with a mixture of triumph and unease. He had succeeded in removing the source of grief, but in its place was something far more unsettling, an emotional void. The patient could no longer experience the complex emotional spectrum that defined his humanity. He was not cured of his grief, as the surgeon had hoped. Instead, he had been rendered emotionally barren, unable to connect with anyone or anything. His once vibrant personality had been replaced by a hollow, vacant shell. He spoke in a monotone, his face expressionless, his movements stiff and mechanical. His family's memory seemed to have faded into oblivion. The very emotions that had once defined him, love, grief, hope, had been erased, leaving behind only an empty, unfeeling vessel. To the surgeon, this result was an unexpected complication, a sign that he had not yet perfected his technique. He had removed the heart, but perhaps he had missed something deeper, something more intricate. He was undeterred. The idea that emotions could be surgically excised still seemed plausible, still seemed possible. He believed that this first experiment, though imperfect, was simply a misstep, nothing more than a learning curve. The heart, after all, was only one part of the puzzle. In the wake of this failure, the surgeon's obsession grew. He became more resolute in his belief that if one organ could house an emotion as powerful as grief, then surely other emotions, love, anger, fear, had their own physical loci within the body. He began to broaden his experiments, turning his attention to other organs, searching for the source of other emotional afflictions. If the heart could house grief, then the liver, with its rich blood supply, could house anger. The stomach, perhaps, was the seat of anxiety or fear. The surgeon's mind, once filled with a sense of rationality, now swirled with the dangerous conviction that he had found the key to eliminating human suffering. And yet, in his fervor, he overlooked the fundamental truth. Emotions are not neatly contained within specific organs. They are complex, intricate processes that involve not only the brain, but the entire body, the entire psyche. With each new patient, the surgeon grew more convinced of the validity of his theories. His confidence in his methods only increased as he performed more surgeries. His patients, many of them emotionally troubled or suffering from psychological trauma, began to flock to him, desperate for relief. They, too, believed in the promise of a life free from emotional pain. Some came seeking release from grief, like the first patient. Others came to rid themselves of fear, anxiety, or anger. In the surgeon's eyes, each new subject was a chance to refine his methods, to perfect the art of emotional excision. But with each new experiment, the consequences grew more severe. Patients returned from their surgeries, not healed, but broken, hollowed out, incapable of feeling anything at all. The surgeon had not freed them from their emotional suffering. Instead, he had trapped them in an existence without feeling, an existence more dreadful than the grief or anger they had sought to escape. As the surgeon's experiments grew more extreme, so too did the consequences of his work. The patients began to show signs of severe emotional numbness. They could no longer feel joy, love, or even anger. Some of them, in their inability to connect with their own emotions, became reclusive, withdrawn from the world. Others were left in a state of profound apathy, unable to engage in meaningful relationships or even basic human interaction. The surgeon had not created a race of emotionally enlightened individuals, as he had imagined. He had created a world of the emotionally disabled, men and women who had lost the very thing that made them human. Their personalities, their desires, their very essence had been erased, leaving them with nothing but empty shells. The surgeon, however, was not deterred by these increasingly dismal outcomes. He refused to acknowledge that his theory had failed. Instead, he doubled down, convinced that his work was still on the path to success. In his mind, the problem was not with his theory, but with the flawed execution of his surgeries. Perhaps the organs he had removed were not the right ones. Perhaps he had not gone deep enough, had not excised the emotional centers properly. In his relentless pursuit of emotional liberation, the surgeon's ego began to eclipse his capacity for empathy. He had become so consumed by the idea of emotional removal that he no longer cared about the well-being of his patients. They had become mere subjects in his experiments, tools for his intellectual obsession. The operating room became a place of cold, clinical detachment. Each patient was a new opportunity to test the limits of his theories. With each new incision, the surgeon's conviction deepened. But as the results became more grotesque, so too did the whispers of those who had witnessed his work. Some began to question the surgeon's methods, though their concerns were drowned out by his fervent belief in the righteousness of his cause. In the name of science, in the name of progress, he continued his work, no longer stopping to consider the true cost of his experiments. The patients who had once trusted him now became ghosts of their former selves, wandering the world in a state of profound emotional exile. They had not been healed. They had not been liberated. They had been destroyed, piece by piece, organ by organ. But the surgeon could not see this. He could not see the tragedy he had wrought, because in his mind, he was still on the path to greatness. He had not yet reached his goal, but he was close, so close. And yet, with each new patient, with each new failure, the surgeon's vision of emotional purity became more and more distorted. What began as a quest for healing had devolved into a grotesque, obsessive drive to conquer the human soul itself. And in the end, it was not just his patients who were affected by his work. The surgeon himself had become a casualty of his own obsession, blinded by his belief that he could excise the very essence of what made people human. As the surgeon's reputation spread, so too did the complexity of his patients. He was no longer merely treating those suffering from grief or emotional despair. His practice had attracted individuals with a range of psychological ailments. People from all walks of life came to him, each one desperate for a cure, a solution to the emotional pain that they carried within them. The surgeon, always eager to test his theories, began to perform surgeries on those who were grappling with a variety of emotional disorders, including intense anger, crippling anxiety, and profound depression. These were individuals who believed that their emotional afflictions were like a disease, something to be eradicated. In the surgeon's hands, they saw an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to rid themselves of their emotional burdens once and for all. The first few surgeries were marked by a sense of hope, both on the part of the patients and the surgeon. They had come to him believing in the possibility of a new life, one free from the emotional chaos that had held them hostage for so long. The surgeon, for his part, remained confident in his methods, convinced that he was on the brink of discovering a way to permanently eliminate the root causes of emotional suffering. Each surgery, each organ removed, seemed to bring him closer to his goal of creating a human being free from the limitations of emotion. But what he had failed to understand, what he had failed to account for, was the inherent danger in his obsession. For every patient that left his operating table, there were consequences, ripples in the lives of those who had placed their trust in him. What began as an attempt to alleviate suffering soon began to resemble something much darker, a systematic destruction of the human spirit. As the surgeon's practice grew, so too did his disregard for the well-being of his patients. The line between medical science and unethical experimentation began to blur. The initial belief that he was performing surgeries for the betterment of his patients gave way to a more unsettling reality. He was manipulating them, shaping them into something they were never meant to be. What began as an attempt to relieve emotional suffering slowly morphed into an exploration of control, of power over the very core of human experience. The surgeon was no longer interested in curing emotional pain. He was interested in creating a new kind of person, one who was devoid of the emotional turbulence that often defined human existence. One of his most notable patients was a woman named Clara, whose life had been consumed by paralyzing fear. From childhood, Clara had lived in constant terror, unable to function normally in society due to her crippling anxiety. She had tried countless treatments, therapy, medications, even time spent in quiet contemplation in remote locations, but nothing had ever worked. Her fear seemed to emanate from deep within her, as though it were an intrinsic part of her very being. She had heard of the surgeon's radical approach and, desperate for relief, sought him out. To Clara, the idea of removing her fear seemed like a miracle, a way to escape the prison that had held her captive for so long. The surgeon, eager to prove the efficacy of his methods, welcomed Clara into his practice. He was convinced that the seat of her fear lay somewhere in her body, that the source of her anxiety could be located and removed. In his mind, fear was simply a physical reaction, a malfunction of the body that could be corrected with the proper surgical intervention. To him, Clara's anxiety was no different from an infection, something to be excised, a problem to be solved. He believed that by removing the organ responsible for her fear, he would grant her a life free from anxiety, a life of calm and peace. The operation was long and meticulous. The surgeon, having already performed several similar procedures, moved with an unsettling confidence as he made his incisions, carefully navigating his way toward the organs he believed were responsible for Clara's overwhelming fear. He had read extensively about the physiology of fear, even though his understanding of it was still based on theory rather than proven science. His confidence, however, was unshaken. He had made similar claims before and, in his mind, had succeeded in his goal to cure emotional suffering. He believed that if he could just locate the correct organ, Clara would walk out of the operating room free from the emotional weight that had haunted her for years. When Clara awoke from the surgery, the surgeon was eager to hear about the results. But what he found was not what he had hoped for. While Clara was no longer gripped by the paralyzing fear that had once consumed her, she had become an entirely different person. She was calm, yes, but she was also distant, emotionally flat. Her interactions with the world around her seemed mechanical, devoid of the warmth and empathy that once made her who she was. Clara could no longer feel the nuances of human experience, the joy of a child's laughter, the comfort of a friend's touch, the sorrow of a lost love. Instead, she existed in a kind of emotional limbo, unable to connect with others in the way she once had. She was neither happy nor sad, she simply was. It was as though the very essence of who she was had been surgically removed along with her fear. The surgeon, undeterred by the results, dismissed Clara's emotional numbness as a temporary side effect. In his mind, this was just another challenge to overcome, another problem to solve. He believed that, with time, Clara's emotional balance would return, and that the emotional void left in the wake of her surgery would be filled with a newfound sense of peace. But what he had failed to grasp was the profound truth of the human condition, that emotions, as painful and difficult as they might be, are what give life meaning. It was the full range of human emotions, joy, sorrow, love, anger, fear, that made people capable of living rich, meaningful lives. To remove one emotion was to strip away a part of what made Clara human. As Clara's emotional numbness persisted, the surgeon began to grow frustrated. His belief in his own theories had been unwavering, but now, as his patients continued to return with increasingly disturbing side effects, cracks began to appear in his confidence. His practice, once celebrated as revolutionary, was now attracting criticism from the medical community. Some colleagues began to question the validity of his methods, suggesting that the surgeon's radical theories were not grounded in sound scientific principles. Others, more concerned with the welfare of the patients, began to raise ethical objections, arguing that his surgeries were not only ineffective but cruel. But the surgeon, driven by a growing obsession with his goal, could not accept these criticisms. To him, his work was not only scientifically sound, it was morally justified. He had convinced himself that by removing the sources of emotional pain, he was performing a public service, that he was helping his patients in a way no one else could. Clara, like many of the surgeon's other patients, began to withdraw from the world. Her once vibrant personality had been replaced by a quiet, emotionless shell. She no longer had the capacity to feel joy or sorrow, love or hate. The very emotions that made her who she was had been stripped away, and in their place was an eerie calmness, a sense of disconnection from the human experience. She did not regret the surgery, for she could not feel regret. She did not miss the fear that had once dominated her life, for she had no capacity to feel the absence of something that had been removed. And yet, there was something deeply unsettling about the hollowness that remained. What had the surgeon really cured? Had he liberated her from her fear, or had he merely removed the essence of her soul, leaving behind a lifeless body that walked through the motions of life without ever truly living? As the surgeon continued his work, the consequences of his actions began to mount. He had begun with a simple theory, that emotions could be isolated and removed, but the reality of his experiments had proved far more complex and far more destructive. His patients, once vibrant and full of life, had become mere shadows of themselves, their personalities lost in the wake of his surgical interventions. They were no longer people, they were empty vessels, devoid of the very qualities that made them human. And yet, the surgeon continued his work, convinced that he was on the brink of a medical breakthrough, unable to see the catastrophic effects of his obsession. His patients, many of whom had come to him in search of relief, had found themselves trapped in a nightmare of emotional numbness. They had not been cured. They had been erased. And as the surgeon's work continued, the line between medical advancement and moral atrocity became increasingly difficult to discern. As the surgeon continued with his controversial experiments, the consequences of his actions began to ripple through the community, both within the medical world and beyond. His patients, once filled with hope and desperation, had become shadows of their former selves, their emotional cores removed, leaving them devoid of the very essence of what made them human. The surgeon, however, remained steadfast in his belief that he was on the brink of a revolutionary breakthrough. He saw his work as a necessary sacrifice, a step toward a new kind of humanity, one that was free from the pain and suffering caused by emotions. But as more patients came forward, their lives marred by his surgeries, the surgeon's work began to take a more sinister turn. One patient, a young woman named Maria, had come to the surgeon seeking relief from her overwhelming sadness. She had been in a state of deep depression for years, unable to find solace in the world around her. Her depression had consumed her, leaving her unable to function in society, alienated from her family and friends. Maria had tried everything, medication, therapy, even spiritual guidance, but nothing had worked. Her sadness had become an all-encompassing part of her identity. When she heard of the surgeon and his radical methods, She believed he might be the answer to her suffering. The idea of removing the source of her sorrow seemed like a miracle, a chance to finally be free of the emotional weight that had burdened her for so long. The surgeon, ever confident in his theories, welcomed Maria into his practice. He believed that her depression was a physical ailment, an imbalance in one of her organs that could be corrected with surgery. To him, the heart was not just the organ that pumped blood, it was the seat of emotions like sadness, joy, and love. Maria, in the surgeon's mind, had an excess of sorrow that could be removed like an infection. With her consent, the surgeon prepared to perform the procedure, convinced that he could rid her of her sadness and restore her to a life of normalcy. The surgery, like the others before it, was long and meticulous. The surgeon worked with the precision of someone who believed he was not only a doctor but a visionary, someone whose methods would change the world. He made his incision and began to carefully excise the organ that he believed was responsible for Maria's emotional affliction. As he worked, the thought of what he was doing never fully registered with him. In his mind, he was simply removing a disease. Emotions, after all, were nothing more than physical processes in his eyes. He had seen it as a noble cause, eliminating emotional suffering, one organ at a time. The idea that what he was doing could be destructive, or even dangerous, was beyond his comprehension. When Maria awoke from the surgery, she felt different. At first, it seemed like a success. She no longer felt the crushing sadness that had weighed her down for years. But as the days passed, it became clear that something was deeply wrong. Maria did not feel happy, nor did she feel any of the other emotions that should have filled her in the aftermath of such a radical procedure. Instead, she felt nothing. There was a void within her, a space where her emotions should have been. She moved through life mechanically, performing tasks without joy or enthusiasm. Her interactions with her family and friends became strained, as they no longer recognized the person she had once been. Maria had lost her sadness, but she had lost everything else as well. The vibrant, emotional being she once was had been replaced by an empty shell, a person unable to feel or connect with the world around her. As Maria's condition worsened, the surgeon became increasingly desperate. He had seen similar results with other patients, but he refused to accept that his methods might be flawed. His belief in the efficacy of his surgery was unwavering, despite the mounting evidence that his interventions were causing more harm than good. Maria's case was just another example of what he had to overcome, he told himself. Perhaps he had removed the wrong organ, perhaps he had not gone deep enough. He continued to perform surgery after surgery, each one more radical than the last, each patient a further test of his theories. But as his list of failures grew, so too did the whispers surrounding his work. Some of his colleagues began to speak out, questioning the ethical implications of his procedures. Others raised concerns about the long-term consequences for the patients who had undergone his surgeries. But the surgeon was deaf to these voices. To him, his work was not just a series of surgeries. It was a mission, a calling to rid humanity of the emotional burdens that had plagued it for centuries. His obsession with his vision blinded him to the suffering he was causing. The surgeon's practice, once filled with patients seeking relief from their emotional suffering, began to dwindle. Those who had heard of his work were now wary, and many of his former patients, once so eager to undergo his procedures, began to speak out about the devastating consequences of his surgeries. Some had lost their ability to feel anything at all, while others had been left with emotional scars that would never heal. The very thing they had hoped would free them from their suffering had instead left them broken, trapped in a world where emotions were but a distant memory. Yet, even as his practice began to falter, the surgeon remained unshaken. He believed that the problem was not with his theories or his methods, but with the people who came to him. They had not understood the true nature of his work, he thought. They had come to him with unrealistic expectations, seeking a quick fix to the complexities of human emotion. What they did not realize, he believed, was that the removal of emotions required sacrifice. It was not just the pain and suffering of grief or anger that needed to be removed. It was the very core of the human experience. To rid oneself of one emotion was to sacrifice others, to give up the fullness of life itself. But in his single-mindedness, the surgeon failed to see the fundamental flaw in his thinking. He had believed that emotions could be isolated and excised, that they were nothing more than physical entities that could be removed. He had failed to understand that emotions were not separate from the self. They were, in fact, integral to it. To remove them was not to cure a disease, but to destroy the very thing that made people human. The surgeon's obsession began to take a toll on him as well. His colleagues turned their backs on him, no longer willing to be associated with his increasingly dangerous experiments. His reputation, once that of a promising young doctor on the cutting edge of medical science, was now one of infamy. He became isolated, his practice a shell of what it once was. Yet, even as his world crumbled around him, the surgeon remained convinced that he was right. The patients who had come to him seeking relief were, in his mind, the ones who had failed to understand his vision. They were not his victims. They were simply the casualties of progress. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the surgeon's work was the toll it took on his patients. In his mind, he was doing them a service, offering them a chance at freedom from the emotional pain that had tormented them for so long. But in reality, he had taken away something irreplaceable, their ability to feel, to love, to experience the full range of human emotions. The surgeon's patients had come to him seeking a cure, but what they received instead was a hollow existence, a life devoid of the very things that made them truly alive. In the end, the surgeon's work proved to be not only a failure but a tragedy. His patients were left broken, their emotional lives shattered beyond repair. The surgeon, too, was a casualty of his own obsession. He had set out to cure human suffering, but instead, he had caused immeasurable harm. His name would be remembered not as that of a visionary doctor, but as that of a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the destructive consequences of treating emotions as diseases to be eradicated. The legacy of the surgeon would not be one of triumph, but of sorrow, a reminder that the complexities of human emotion cannot be surgically removed, and that to tamper with them is to tamper with the very essence of what it means to be human. As the surgeon's experiments continued, the true magnitude of his work began to unfold, but not in the way he had anticipated. His medical career, once fueled by optimism and the belief that he was uncovering a revolutionary understanding of the human mind, began to unravel with each failed attempt. Despite his fervent belief in his own theories, it was clear to others, and to some of his patients, that his methods were not curing emotional suffering, but exacerbating it. The surgeon had started with a mission to eliminate the emotional pain of his patients, to free them from the shackles of grief, fear, and sadness. But with each operation, it became increasingly evident that he was creating a far worse condition, one where the very essence of his patient's humanity was slowly being excised, organ by organ, emotion by emotion. The idea that emotions could be surgically removed had captivated the surgeon's mind in a way that nothing else could. He believed that by eradicating the physical source of emotional distress, he could create a new, perfected version of human existence. This belief was rooted in the scientific thinking of his time, which viewed the body as a machine that could be dissected, repaired, and perfected. But what he failed to grasp was the inherent complexity of human nature, the fact that emotions are not isolated to single organs or physical locations. They are not simply biological reactions to stimuli, but deep, multifaceted experiences that shape every aspect of a person's identity, behavior, and consciousness. The surgeon's single-minded pursuit of this false ideal led him to disregard the fundamental truth. Emotions are an integral part of the human experience, and to remove them is to strip away what makes people human in the first place. The consequences of the surgeon's work began to manifest more clearly as the patients who had undergone his procedures returned, not healed, but hollowed out. There were those who had once been vibrant individuals, people full of passion, love, and energy, who now moved through the world like walking corpses, incapable of feeling anything at all. They were neither happy nor sad, neither angry nor peaceful. They were trapped in an emotional void, unable to connect with the world around them. Their lives had been drained of color and meaning, reduced to a dull monotony of existence. Some patients, like Clara, became so emotionally numb that they withdrew from society completely, unable to interact with family, friends, or anyone who might have offered them some semblance of support. They had become ghosts in their own lives, unable to experience the very things that make life worth living. Others were left in a state of perpetual confusion. One such patient, a man named Richard, had come to the surgeon seeking relief from his anger. For years, he had struggled with intense, uncontrollable bursts of rage, which had ruined his relationships and caused him to lose his job. Richard believed that if he could simply rid himself of the anger that consumed him, he could rebuild his life. The surgeon, ever confident in his abilities, assured Richard that his anger was not something psychological or emotional, but a physical malfunction that could be corrected. He believed that if he removed the organ responsible for this outburst of rage, Richard would be able to lead a more peaceful, balanced life. Richard, desperate for a cure, agreed to undergo the procedure. When Richard awoke from the surgery, the results were immediate, but not in the way he had hoped. He no longer felt anger, but he also felt nothing else. He had lost his capacity to engage with the world on any emotional level. While his rage had once been a fierce and consuming force, it had also been a driving energy, something that gave him a sense of purpose, a feeling of passion, and sometimes even love. After the surgery, Richard was left in a state of emotional paralysis. He could not feel happiness, sadness, fear, or any of the emotions that had once colored his life. His relationships, already strained from his temper, fell apart as he became a hollow shell, unable to connect with anyone, even the people closest to him. He no longer had the capacity to experience the highs and lows that had once defined his existence. He had been freed from his anger, but in the process, he had lost everything that made him human. In the wake of such devastating results, the surgeon's colleagues, once silent onlookers, began to speak out against his work. The medical community, which had initially viewed his experiments with curiosity, now turned against him. Some physicians, who had once admired his intellectual rigor, began to raise ethical questions about the nature of his procedures. They asked whether it was right to surgically alter the emotional landscape of a person's mind. They questioned whether it was possible to truly remove emotions without causing irreparable harm to the individual. To these voices, the surgeon remained unyielding. He refused to acknowledge the validity of their concerns. His confidence in his theories had become so deeply ingrained that he no longer had the capacity to listen to those who warned him of the consequences of his work. He became isolated, not just from his colleagues, but from the patients who had once placed their trust in him. The surgeon's obsession with his work only deepened as the negative effects of his procedures became more apparent. He had started out with the belief that emotions were nothing more than physical phenomena that could be isolated and removed, but as his experiments continued, it became clear that this idea was fatally flawed. The more he removed emotions from his patients, the more he saw the consequences of his actions. His patients, rather than being freed from emotional suffering, were now trapped in a psychological void. They had lost the very things that made them who they were. Some of them, like Richard and Clara, became so disconnected from their own feelings that they could no longer interact meaningfully with the world. Others, like Maria, simply went through the motions of life, unable to feel joy, sadness, or any other emotion that made them human. But the surgeon remained resolute in his conviction that he was right. He believed that his surgeries, despite the catastrophic results, were a necessary step toward the evolution of humanity. In his mind, he was performing a public service, freeing people from the emotional suffering that plagued them. What he failed to understand, however, was that his experiments were not curing emotional pain, but removing the very things that gave life its richness and depth. He had set out to create a world of emotionless perfection, but what he had instead created was a nightmare, a world where the full spectrum of human experience had been replaced by a sterile, mechanical existence. As the surgeon continued his work, the toll on his own psyche began to show. The emotional detachment that he had imposed upon his patients slowly began to mirror his own mental state. He had become so consumed by his theories that he had lost sight of the very thing he had once sought to protect, the humanity of his patients, and his own humanity as well. He had been so obsessed with his mission to eradicate emotional suffering that he had failed to see the ultimate cost of his actions.